Good afternoon. I'm Carmen Blair, the Deputy Director of the San Mateo County Historical Association, and I would like to welcome you to today's Courthouse Docket. The Courthouse Docket is a monthly series of lectures and performances sponsored by Cypress Lawn Heritage Foundation. Usually the programs are held in the museum's historic courtroom A. Even though the museum is open again, we are still presenting these programs online. One note on logistics for today's program. If you have questions during the presentation, please type them into the Q&A box, not the chat. We will take the questions at the end of the program. Each month during the Courthouse Docket, we explore different aspects of local history. Today is the 165th anniversary of San Mateo County's first election, so it is an appropriate time to take another look at that event and its legacy. Our presenter is Mitch Postel, the president of the San Mateo County Historical Association since 1984. He taught history at the College of San Mateo, is a frequent speaker on San Mateo County history, and has written 7 books on local history. He is a member of the San Mateo County Historic Resources Advisory Board and the immediate past chairman of the San Mateo County Visitors and Convention Bureau. Please welcome Mitch for his presentation, Legacy of Corruption.
Thank you very much, Carmen. And I'll thank Carmen also for being the technician behind your presentation. And I'll be asking her to change the slides as we go forward into this discussion about the political history, the early political history of San Mateo County. This is a discussion about largely what happened on May the 12th, 1856, 165 years ago. It was San Mateo County's first election day. Why should I title this event that formed our original government a legacy of corruption? Well, let me explain. Slide. It's important to point out that San Mateo County was not one of California's original counties. Here is the Mission Day celebration in San Francisco in 1850. Instead, we were the southern section of San Francisco County. Next slide. At the time of statehood, most of the coastal counties in California were divided by the original boundaries established by the Spanish when defining the borders between the missions. Next slide. Our peninsula was mostly under the authority of the mission at San Francisco. Next slide. Set at the tip of the peninsula to support the Presidio. Next slide. Because of the gold rush, San Francisco grew rapidly. Here is a view of Yerba Buena Cove and Telegraph Hill in early 1849. Next slide. And here, they are from the same vantage point only 6 years later. Note the cove is gone, and look at the building that has gone on. San Francisco had become the most important city on the Pacific slope of North America, some 50,000 strong. Next slide. Meanwhile, down the peninsula, we had a very rural population of only about 2,500 people. Here is Belmont at El Camino in 1850. Next slide. A portion of our part of San Francisco County was represented by Dr. R.O. Tripp, the founder of the Woodside Store. Next slide. Recognizing the differences between North and South, residents on the peninsula began appealing to the state in 1855 for the establishment of a separate county. They wanted to have it called Raimondo. Sounds like a beach community in Southern California, doesn't it? They complained that San Francisco was too far away to be their county seat. Next slide. In 1856, they found some unexpected allies in a roundabout way. Up in San Francisco, a consolidation movement was afoot because having 2 governments, city and county, made it difficult to mount reform campaigns to clean up both. In other words, every time the reformers were able to try to or succeeded in cleaning up city government, it seemed like the rascals got jobs in county government. And then they would clean up the county government, and those same rascals would find jobs back in city government. Next slide. And so in 1856, State Assemblyman Horace Hawes introduced a bill to combine the two governments. But the corrupt elements had allies in state government too, and a compromise would have to be worked out. Next slide. According to a contemporary observer, Benjamin Lathrop, Hawes, quote, Hawes had to make terms with the thieves by adding a clause to his act, cutting off about 9/10 of the county of San Francisco, establishing what is the county of San Mateo. Chris Lilly and Bill Mulligan agreed to accept that much of the county, provided it could be arranged to organize a county government within 1 month after the passage of the act. A clause to that effect was inserted, and the bill passed, unquote. Next slide. So what was this compromise? Well, for city reformers, they got their one government, one city and county of San Francisco. And is that the way it is today? Yes, that's still the way it is for San Francisco. Also, city officials would now have to be bonded, and fixed expenditures were placed on 5 city departments. For the roughs, as Lathrop called them, next slide, they were given a new county, one that they could form without delay, one that they could easily control, and run rackets until the reformers in San Francisco tired of their reform activities and they could come back. Next slide. The roughs. Who were these guys? Well, one was actually, Carmen, could you go back to that this previous slide? That's not time for Billy yet. The roughs, who were they? Well, among them, probably the leader was a guy named Chris Lilly. He owned the Abbey House at the top of the hill at the intersection of San Jose Avenue and Mission Street in today's Daly City. And here was a real character. Back in New York, where he was from, he was quite a famous prize fighter. In 1842, he went 119 rounds with a poor guy named Thomas McCoy before 2,000 spectators at Hastings, New York. He became the first American professional fighter to kill a man in the ring and fled the country, ended up in England, not knowing what might happen to him back in New York. He then was recruited to fight in the Mexican War, the Mexican-American War, and was in the same military outfit as Billy Mulligan. He came to California in 1850, drifted through the mining district with Mulligan and another hard character named Yankee Sullivan. In 1855, he was known to be operating a cockfighting pit in San Francisco, and by 1856, he was owner of this Abbey House. Now, the Abbey House was like a lot of the stagecoach stops that were on the county road, or El Camino as we call it now. And to give you an idea about the political clout that Chris Lilly had, the Abbey House was originally going to be north of the county line. And that would have required Lilly to move his base of operations south. So rather than do that, he talked to his allies in the state government and was able to get the county line moved north of his Abbey House. Hence, Daly City today is in San Mateo County. And now we can take a look at Billy Mulligan. Next slide. Ferret-faced, 120 pounds, not 5'1". He also was a New York prize fighter, also a gambler, and a renowned barroom brawler. There was a legend about him chasing down a man named John Morrissey in New York, who outweighed him by 80 pounds, chased him down a flight of stairs with a pool cue in his hand, and was just a hard character. In 1847, he was jailed in New York on a burglary charge. He escaped and also ended up fighting in the Mexican-American War, where he met Chris Lilly. In 1849, he was in California for the gold rush. He was in frequent trouble as a known ruffian, and in February of 1851, he shot and killed a gambler named William Anderson at Sonora. In the fall of 1851, he fought a duel with a hard character named Jimmy Douglas. In November of 1851, he was wounded in a shootout at the Bella Union Saloon in San Francisco. 6 days later, he was wounded again as a bystander watching a gunfight. Once in San Francisco, he became involved in politics. He would organize his friends into political parties and then would sell, quote, nominations, unquote, to the highest bidder, once receiving $28,000 for one of these. At the time, At this time, he learned the fine art of ballot box stuffing and became a loyal David Broderick man. David Broderick was one of the big political bosses in California. He was also from New York and also had that Irish background. Billy bullied voters for Broderick when fights broke out. Billy was usually there to defend the Broderick cause. And in exchange, Broderick had Billy made tax collector for San Francisco. And at the time of this San Mateo County election in 1856, he was actually also San Francisco's jailkeeper. Next slide. Another member of leader of the group was an ex-governor of California, a man named John Mcdougall. And he joined forces with the Lilly and Mulligan contingent to have his home at Belmont declared county seat. According to the famous California historian of the 19th century, Herbert Howe Bancroft, he was, quote, a gentlemanly drunkard and a Democratic politician of the order for which California was destined to become somewhat unpleasantly notorious. And then in a further description, Bancroft writes, John Mcdougall was born in Ohio in 1818, and in boyhood removed to the vicinity of Indianapolis, Indiana, where he was superintendent of the state prison in 1846. He was a captain in the Mexican War in which he distinguished himself. In 1849, he came to California with his brother George and served in the Constitutional Convention. He was fine-looking and adhered to the old style of ruffled shirt front, buff vest and pantaloons, and blue coat with brass buttons. He used to say that there were two beings of whom he stood in awe, God Almighty and Mrs. Mcdougall. The latter always treated him with patient kindness, although often compelled to bring him home from a midnight debauch. When he was afterwards in the U.S. Senate, he made but one speech in preparation for which he was 3 weeks in sobering it off. On several occasions, he attempted suicide. Although not at that stage of his ruinous career when elected lieutenant governor, he was seldom fit for the discharge of his duties. Yet such was the influence of his naturally genial and generous deportment, cultivated mind, and brilliant social talents that only his political enemies, and not always those, could bring themselves to treat him with the contempt another man in his position would have received. Okay, so those are the main characters. What was their plan? Well, before the local residents know what's going to even happen, they decided that they would stage the elections. Although the Consolidation Act was scheduled to go into effect in July, the election was called for in May to, quote, organize the new county, unquote. And on election day, May 12th, 1856, 3 of the county's 13 voting stations were seized by gang members who stuffed ballot boxes and ran election booths. They used the names of hundreds of recently arrived ship's passengers whose identities would be difficult to trace. So in those days, when men that were off to the gold country arrived at San Francisco at the dock, they would sign in, I have arrived, and then they would go to the gold country. Well, those names became San Francisco's, or rather San Mateo County's first voters. And they had great success. And here we are at Crystal Springs Valley at the Laguna precinct in the Crystal Springs Valley, which had no more than 25 eligible voters. 297 ballots were counted. At Lily's Abbey House Saloon, 500 ballots were tallied in a precinct of no more than 50 voters. In Belmont, votes were compiled in the home of Governor Mcdougall. No local witnesses were even allowed in to monitor the count. Next slide. All ballots were gathered and tabulated at the American Hotel in Redwood City, where Billy Mulligan's men brandished knives and guns and intimidated two of the election's judges, John Johnston of Half Moon Bay and Charles Clark of Colma, who were trying to inspect the ballot. The third judge, Dr. Tripp, refused to have anything to do with this affair. Well, results: out of a total population of 2,500, 1,700 votes were counted. Now, remember that women didn't have the vote at the time, and of course, kids aren't voting. Bernard Mulligan, Billy's brother, was elected sheriff. Chris Lilly's bartender, Robert Gray, becomes county clerk. Other gang members are made county attorney, assessor, and treasurer, as well as assuming one of the 3 supervisorial seats. Thus, this gang certainly had a stranglehold on early San Mateo County history. Now, what unfolded is subject to quite a bit of historical debate, whether you're talking about local history or state history. And so I'm going to try to explain a little bit about that, but everybody's agreed that the locals were up in arms. Next slide. Some honest men made office also. This included Ben Fox of Redwood City, who won as judge, and he spearheaded an immediate investigation into the election. Also, now local historians tell us that one of the good guys, John Johnston, won one of the 3 supervisorial seats. But when we think about that for a minute, wasn't he also an election judge? And he wins as supervisor? It's kind of interesting. His brother is the more famous of the Johnsons. Next slide. He's famous for having that salt box, New England style salt box house out on the San Mateo County coast. But this oldest brother, James Johnson, born in Scotland in 1813, moved with his parents to Pennsylvania in 1833, then Ohio. In 1835, he fought in the Seminole Indian War. He explored the Rocky Mountains, fought also in the Mexican-American War. 1849, he was off to California with everyone else for the gold rush, and he arrived here as a 36-year-old man. As part owner of the infamous El Dorado Saloon up in San Francisco, he became well-to-do. Next slide. And gained respectability by marrying Petra Dahara of an old California family. While in San Francisco, he sent back his brother Thomas to Ohio to convince his other brothers, William and John, to come west with a dairy herd. There wasn't yet a dairy established in California, and he wanted to establish one of the first, if not the first. And so the brothers drove the cattle out. And in the meantime, James purchased about 1,200 acres from the Miramontes family, just a little bit south of Half Moon Bay, to start this dairy business. Now think about that journey, driving those domesticated dairy cattle across the rivers, through the prairies, across the Rocky Mountains, the deserts, the Sierra Nevada. But the brothers used to joke that the hardest part of their journey was to get the cattle from the bay side of San Mateo County over to the coast side, because there weren't any roads. That first year on the coast was a rough one for the Johnstons. Many of the calves that they brought or that were born in that first season were eaten by grizzly bears, and they had a real pioneer experience. Next slide. Now, while James was continuing to live in San Francisco, his brothers set about creating the dairy ranch, including building the salt box house that we referred to earlier, which was modeled after the family home back in Ohio. And probably John was engaged in building this house at the very same time as the election of 1856. Now, Johnson's supposed to be one of the good guys. He received 1,313 votes of the 1,646 cast in the rigged election. That's 80%. It was the largest margin of victory in the fixed election. Not until 16 years later, when San Mateo County had twice the population, did a ballot count even approach this. Another victor for a supervisorial seat was the other judge in the election, and that was Charles Clark. And he assumed the political powers that were once kept by a man named James Casey. Next slide. Casey had been a Broderick man, but he had fallen from favor and was probably despondent about that. And 2 days after the election, on the very day that the results of the San Mateo County election were announced, James King of William, editor of the San Francisco Bulletin, a newspaper, ran a story on Casey explaining that he had a record and served time at Sing Sing Penitentiary. Next slide. Casey was furious, went to James King of William's office, threatened him, and 1 hour later killed him in the streets of San Francisco. Next slide. And this incident created the famous Vigilance Committee of 1856. Next slide. Vigilantes seized Casey and hanged him. And here he's right next to a guy named Charles Cora, an unfortunate Italian gambler. And they were strung up both at the same time. Fear hit the underworld at this point, and Mulligan and Lilly and others flee the state. Vigilantes take control. James Atkinson of Redwood City, who had lost the sheriff's race to Bernard Mulligan, brings suit on the elections, and a new start for San Mateo County was achieved. Next slide. There's a large question here in California history about this vigilantism. Is taking the law in your own hands ever justified? And a historical debate still goes on. The great California historian, H.H. Bancroft, who we referred to before, he believed that two strong factions were preying upon society at the time: corrupt politicians and criminals. And they were in league together. Criminals would stuff ballot boxes and intimidate legitimate voters. And then politicians would do their best to get such men off when caught for related or unrelated crimes. Next slide. This is Fort Gunnybags, which was the Vigilantes' headquarters. To Bancroft, the righteousness of the Vigilantes can partially be seen in their numbers: 8,000 at one time. And as Bancroft claims, crime never again reached dangerous proportions in the city. And a lid was put on public spending. Next slide. As you can see, expenditures fell from more than $2.5 million in 1855 to 353,000 by 1857 by the work of the Vigilance Committee. Now, Bancroft's critics, especially as we get further into the 20th century, and California history is going through several revisions, they believe that Bancroft indulged in the most elaborate defenses and rationalization of these popular tribunals on such grounds as the sacred right of revolution. Now, you all know about the sacred right of revolution. This is in the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson said that if government is not doing its job, then the people have the right to overthrow it. Bancroft, according to his critics, maintained that the Vigilantes saw themselves as the people. But they were self-appointed. They saw themselves as the best people and thought of themselves as above the law. The 20th century historian Walton Bean, who was my professor at the University of California, Berkeley, he wrote, and he was probably the most critical of the vigilantes. He wrote about them: vigilantism was a manifestation of moral self-delusion and righteous sadism. Bean believed that James King of William was pompous and had it coming, this newspaper editor that was assassinated by Casey. King added William to his name, according to Walton Bean, because another James King living in the District of Columbia, where it was from, also had that name. He came to San Francisco in 1848 and became a wealthy banker, but the sudden loss of his fortune embittered him, and he became a newspaper editor in order to attack the various men upon whom he blamed his own troubles and those of the city. His editorship of the Bulletin was sort of a journalistic vigilantism, according to Bean. And on the expose of Casey, and this is a quote, "A great many men had come from other parts of the country to escape their past. So many so that it was often considered a necessary convention in California that a man's past was nobody's business," unquote. Bean pointed out that many good citizens there in San Francisco opposed the vigilantes, including the mayor, a man named Van Ness, the sheriff, a guy named Scannell, who actually turned out to be pretty notorious himself. William Tecumseh Sherman was against the vigilantes. Of course, you recognize that name. He would become a famous Civil War general, but at the time was commander of a local militia. And finally, Governor John Mcdougall, who you've already met, quote, whose popularity and reputation in the state had been destroyed when he had issued proclamations criticizing the earlier Committee of Vigilance. So there had been an 1851 Committee of Vigilance as well. Bean says that overall, quote, the charges that the city government had been corrupt and ineffective had some basis. Well, if you look at those numbers, there's some basis. And then back to Bean. But vigilantism brought no permanent reform to the conditions. Now, local historians more or less agree with the 19th century version of the story. And we're talking about Frank Stanger and Al Hinding. But I kind of like the description given by Josiah Rice, who was a 19th century historian. Next slide. Actually, we're not ready for the next slide. We can go back. He described the 1856 affair as, quote, a businessman's revolution, one in which there was an application of private enterprise to the administration of justice. As described, the cost of government is cut back 5/6. And the philosophy of the vigilantes clearly reflected the attitude of most early California businessmen. They disliked and distrusted government and public office holders. They resented taxation, and they had contempt for politicians as an inferior class of people. Now, those of us that can remember the Proposition 13 days in California kind of remember that same kind of talk. But when Proposition 13 was passed in 1978, we had direct democracy in California. We had the referendum, the recall, and the initiative. But the people back then did not have it. And in order to be able to change things in a hurry, they had to take the law into their own hands. Okay, now we're ready for the next slide. Now, county historian Al Hinding talks about some of the larger implications, not only for San Mateo County history, but also for San Francisco and for California history. He tells us that now San Francisco was cut off from growth. And this is his quote: in time, San Franciscans would be forced to turn to San Mateo for their water. Next slide. Their airport. Here's Millsfield about 1930. And next slide. Even their cemeteries. And I'll add their tax base. Next slide. Hinding again, quote, San Mateo County remained a thinly settled backwater with the smallest and slowest growing population of any Bay Area county, unquote. Next slide. Now, the point that Al kind of misses in his book from 1982, and a chance to tie all this up with his later chapters that discuss San Mateo County's problems with corruption during the early part of the 20th century, that this thinly populated county abutted against the sophisticated and more populous one would now be a place that those looking to get away with different kinds of things could. This would be an outlet for San Francisco illegal activity. And a great example, an early example, was that dueling in San Francisco was outlawed. Of course, dueling in all of California was outlawed, but it could be prevented in San Francisco. But if you cross the county line, you could engage in dueling. And one of the most famous duels in all of California history, really, in all of the history of the West, was a duel that was fought out by this guy. He was one of the antagonists. His name was Judge Terry, David Terry, and he was a California Supreme Court justice, and he shot it out with none other than David Broderick. Next slide. You remember David Broderick? He was that political boss, and by the time of this duel in 1859, Broderick had become a United States senator. So here you're seeing a lithograph of a California Supreme Court justice shooting and killing a United States senator, and the reason for their dispute was over slavery. Broderick was a Northerner and Terry was a Southerner. Next slide. And this kind of activity would be long lasting. Now, for example, when prize fighting became illegal in San Francisco, some of the most famous prize fights that would have dateline San Francisco really fought out just across the county line in Daly City or Colma. Next slide. Oh, problems with Prohibition. Sure, you could get a drink in San Francisco, but San Mateo County was so notorious. Stills and rum running, and here's a speakeasy. The problems were just out of control. And then after Prohibition, next slide, problems with gambling. Dog racing in San Francisco, of course, is illegal, but come down San Mateo County, there are dog tracks. Next slide. And the gambling had a great effect on law enforcement. It was very difficult in this sparse county to be able to control these very powerful gambling interests. And of course, many of the law enforcement representatives were unfortunately bribed. Next slide. Here we have a lampooning of one of the big bosses during the gambling era in North County, and he was a big mucky muck with the Tanforan racetrack. His name was John Marchbank, and he was pretty much known to control things in San Mateo County during his era. Next slide. Now back a little bit to our discussion about the 1856 incident and what had happened. A part of what went on, and especially if you look at recent histories about the vigilantes of those days, you can detect in a lot of the writing and a lot of the statements a certain anti-Irish tone. And when you think about the bad guys that we talked about, David Broderick, Chris Lilly, Billy Mulligan, James Casey, I mean, all those are Irish Catholic characters. Remember, the good guys like John Johnston and Charles Clark, who might have been just as guilty as the others, they're sort of given a pass. Next slide. And so it's important for us to kind of give a little defense for the Irish at the time, because they had great positive impact on California and on our county. By the 1870s, a tenth of the population of California, and probably more than a tenth here in San Mateo County, were making a pretty big impact. So if you have more than 10% of the population here in San Mateo County, it made that group the largest immigrant group on the peninsula. And early on, they were mostly farmers, but they became engaged in a variety of businesses, and were early on also leaders in various public institutions. The thing about the Irish, as was different for most every other group that came to California, is that most that came here to make a fortune and then return from wherever they were from, and that meant if you were from another state in the Union, or whether you were from another country, it didn't matter. Most of the early Argonauts had that in mind: make a fortune and go back. The Irish, because of the problems back in their home country, they didn't really see that as an option. They had come to California to stay. And here we have a party of workers that are at the Crystal Springs Dam about 1888. And among their contributions to our local history was the building of that dam. And so that concludes my slide presentation. I am available for questions. I think, Carmen, we probably have enough time.
Yeah, we do have enough time for questions. Just as a reminder to everyone, please use the Q&A box for any questions that you might have. There was one that came in while you were speaking. Where is the salt box located? So where is the Johnston House?
Okay, so if you're on Highway 1 and you're driving south and you get just a little bit past the town of Half Moon Bay itself, look to the east, and there's an artichoke field right in front of it, but then, and it's very visible. Then as you look up the hill, you'll see this incredible white house, and it's been restored by a historical group there, the Johnston House Foundation. And I believe it's open on certain days of the month. And it's a very cool visit if you ever get the chance to go that way.
And how did Redwood City become the county seat instead of Belmont?
Well, when the election was deemed to be rigged, Belmont, of course, had won and was destined to be county seat. But then, of course, the results of the election were tossed away. And with the tossing away, Redwood City just sort of became the county seat. Through the years, it would be challenged. That status would be challenged, especially by San Mateo. But through all the years, Redwood City has been able to stave that off. And after all, Redwood City was the largest Bayside town and probably deserved that status, and had that, and was probably and was actually the largest Bayside town right through the 19th century and into the early part of the 20th century.
Southern San Mateo County used to be part of Santa Cruz County. What events or circumstances prompted the annexation of this formerly Santa Cruz lands?
So by 1868, that little tail of San Mateo County on the coast side, the people that were living there just felt that the geographical boundaries were so significant to try to get themselves represented in Santa Cruz County that they petitioned to the state to allow them to become part of San Mateo County. And so their wishes were answered, and they're part of and that beautiful section of our coastline is very thankfully in San Mateo County today.
Do you think that this information should be taught in our schools?
Oh, of course. You might, I mean, you might tone some of it down. I mean, this presentation was obviously meant for adults, but I think that kids should know this story. Yes.
After San Francisco and San Mateo County split, when San Francisco was realizing they were losing money, were there any efforts to combine the counties back into one?
Oh yeah. As a matter of fact, it didn't. It took some decades, but especially through the early part of the 20th century, there were numerous attempts to get San Mateo County and San Francisco County back together. You know, it was known to be a mistake that had happened to begin with, and it was just, you know, political quirkiness really that there became two counties, and that people pointed that, you know, look at Los Angeles and what it's being able to do, and why it's becoming a major city is because it can expand, it can have airfields, and it can have a chance to develop water resources, and it can do many of the things that San Francisco was trapped and couldn't do. And it was felt that for the benefit of the Bay Area, that there be sort of a greater, sort of like New York, like there be a greater San Francisco community with boroughs and so forth. And there was very serious attempts in the latter part of the 1920s and into the early part of the 1930s to do that. But gradually those efforts fell apart. There was a lot of political people by that time that had a vested interest in keeping San Mateo County separate, and their way won.
Question on the duel. Where in San Mateo was the duel with Judge Terry taking place, and is there a marker there?
There is a marker, and it's in present-day Daly City, and I believe that it's part of a little park, and that it's near a golf course. And I don't have all the particulars right in front of me, but I think that you can pretty much find it by going on the internet and just looking at the Broderick Terry duel site, because there is a marker there.
Do you happen to know the approximate percentage of California counties that were not original ones, and what formed the other counties?
Boy, these are questions. I believe there's 50 something counties today, and I think that there were 18 original counties, but I could be wrong about that.
Okay. How did the Mills Field property become become the San Francisco airport?
So in 1926, San Francisco was very anxious that it have an airfield, and the closest place that they could come where the weather were permitted, where you could have an airfield, was there on the Mills family property. And they had a big dairy there and a mansion. And as a matter of fact, the mansion sat where Mills Peninsula Hospital is today. The city went to the family and first leased the property. And the hope was that if they named the place Mills Field or Mills Airport, that eventually the family would donate the land necessary for an airport to the city and county of San Francisco. That never happened. And by the end of the 1920s, the city did purchase the land and struggled for quite a few years, all the way up until World War II, to try to maintain that airport. The Chronicle called it a prize mud hole. But of course, during World War II, millions of dollars were invested into it by the Army. And by the end of the war, San Francisco Airport, which was now known as San Francisco International Airport, had become a place where 1/10 of the air traffic in all the United States was traveling through. So it was kind of a real instant success story due to the massive construction during World War II.
What was the state of Native Americans at this point when San Mateo County formed, and where were they, if any, survived?
Yeah, well, that's a very sad story, of course. Mostly all of the Indians that had lived in what we'd call San Mateo County today during the pre-mission kind of period, all had been rounded up and moved up to San Francisco to be Christianized. And they were brought back down the peninsula at times in an organized way to help farm the land and do things for the mission. Now, after secularization, That is, after Mexico takes over from Spain and the lands are taken away from the missions, some of the old mission Indians, and they weren't necessarily the same people that had lived on the peninsula before, but many of those people that were at the mission that had been Indians from all over California, there were some communities that were established down the peninsula. And around San Mateo, as a matter of fact, the city of San Mateo, there was known to be a small contingent of some of these native people. But as the 19th century wore on, that population became less and less until there practically was none. Into the 20th century, there was a couple of Indian people that lived out at Coyote Point. But more or less, historians had believed that most of the all of California, or all of San Mateo County's small tribes had disappeared, and that the people were extinct until just a few years ago, when a man named Jonathan Cadero, who is a instructor down at a Lutheran college in Southern California, was able to prove that his family lineage went back to the little village of Perurastack, and the people there were Arame people, Ohlone, that lived at Pacifica. And he could show that his family dated all the way back to that village. And I mean, his family becomes all that we know of the original Indians of San Mateo County, and he's been very gracious to our historical association in that he every time we have a interpretation that we want to do about something about the Indians of San Mateo County, we always go to him to make sure that we've got all the P's and Q's correct, and that we're not stumbling into being insulting to Native people, which is something that happens quite frequently in historical interpretation about Native people. And he's just been terrific about this. And except for paying for some of his travel expenses, he's been doing this as just a volunteer effort. And he's just a terrific guy, and we're lucky to have him on our team.
We have a question about Bancroft. Is Bancroft's writing to be trusted? Is it accurate or tainted by opinion?
Well, factually, he gets a lot of stuff right, but he's a 19th century historian. And he's you have to judge him as being Anglo and Protestant and among the business class of San Francisco, and he's going to have he's going to have a certain kind of prejudices that are going to be part of that. Now he's also quite accurate about a lot of the stuff that happened. It's just that he's going to have certain slants that he's going to take on things. And as you read Bancroft, you just have to be kind of aware. You need to put things in context to his writing during the 19th century.
If you know, are there any 1856 historic bars still open and operating today?
Well, I wish there were. I'd go have a drink after this.
Well, how about the mile houses? How far back do those date?
Well, I think the mile houses that are established today do not go back to the 1850s, but there's the 7 Mile House, which is very active, which is in Brisbane. And then there's a mile house that's in Millbrae, but I believe that's been moved or something. So there's not too many of these. Now, if you want to see what one of the bars look like out of one of the mile houses or stagecoach stops, we actually have 2 in our museum. I'm told that we have more bars in our museum than any other museum around. But we have 2 actual bars, and we also have quite a few saloon scenes in one of our galleries, so that you can get an idea about what those places look like. Malloy's, which is out in Colma, that's has a very authentic flavor to it, but was more, I think, a streetcar stop than a stagecoach stop.
There was a question just quickly about the territory of the Ramaytush
Okay.
natives.
So that was, they were mostly San Mateo County people. That was a language group. And there were quite a few tribes that were part of that language group. And then of the tribes, there were quite a few villages.
And then going on this idea of corruption that continued in San Mateo County, you mentioned Tan Fran Racetrack. Can you touch on the contract killing of Tom Keene, who was associated with Bay Meadows?
I can't.
Okay.
Stumped me, and I know it happened. It
I
wasn't a
remember seeing a
glorious
picture of the headline.
Yeah, it wasn't a glorious moment. Let's just put it that way. But I'm not going to elaborate just because I don't know all the details.
Okay, I have quite a few questions here that are topics of entire different presentations. So I have some great ideas from this about some of the other presentations that we can do in the future.
Can I handle one? Maybe I'll just handle one. Maybe I can't handle it.
I'm trying to pick the right one.
Okay.
Is it true that early coastsiders were mainly hiding out escapists?
No, that's not true. Okay. I think I'm understanding where that's going. So if they're talking about Half Moon Bay, so the story there is that there were two land grant families there during Mexican times. There was the Murimanes family that were on the south side of Pilar-Cetus Creek, and the Vasquez family was on the north side of Pilar-Cetus Creek. And in early American days, right after the Mexican-American War was fought, there became a little settlement there, and they called their place San Benito. But as things got more and more violent in San Francisco and it became harder for Spanish-speaking people to live there in comfort, more and more Spanish-speaking people came down to live at San Benito, and people on the other side of the hill began to call it Spanish Town because everybody there spoke Spanish, and that was kind of a place where people could go to get out of some of the pressures and ethnic kinds of prejudices that were going on in other parts of the Bay region. So maybe that's what they thought. And of course, today it's known as Half Moon Bay. But you can look at the original maps of San Mateo County, and you don't see Half Moon Bay as the village. It's called Spanish Town, and maybe that's the answer to that question. Maybe.
And my final question here, and yes, I do see several others, but my final question is, how does San Mateo County collect its history? Through city historical associations, or who?
Well, I consider us to be, the major repository. We have archives, and we have a professional archivist, and we have a professional curator. So when things are offered to us, if they have a real historical importance, we take them in. And as a matter of fact, we have, and I'm speaking about I mean the San Mateo County Historical Association has nearly 500,000 different kinds of things. Now, some of them are very large, like horse-drawn vehicles and carriages and so forth. But a lot of it is, you say, 500,000 things, a lot of it can be a single piece of paper, a map or a photograph or something like that. But we have an awfully good archives, and it can be, and it's accessible. You can make appointments with our archivist. Her name is Deborah Peterson. And come on in and take a look at what we've got. Most of the stuff is on card file. It's not computerized as yet, although you can find a lot of our collection on our website. Carmen, you can tell them how to get to stuff, and it's all available to you. You can look at photographs and publications that we've done. So I would say that, number one, I would point the finger at us, but certainly there are other very well-run historical societies in the various cities of the county. And I think depending upon which one you're interested in, you could probably find them on the internet as well.
Thank you, Mitch.
You're
I
welcome.
often get questions about recordings of our presentation. This program today will be available on the Courthouse Docket page of our website by tomorrow, and will be there for about a month. Mitch mentioned our online collections database that is also available through our website. I would like to invite you to join us for our next Courthouse Docket on Saturday, June 26th at 1 p.m. A year ago, I gave a presentation that was an overview of the great estates, and I was asked at that time for a presentation concentrating on just a few. Well, the topic in June is 3 great estates, and we will have panelists representing Ralston Hall, Filoli, and Carolyn's. I want to thank you all for joining us, and I hope to see you soon here at the San Mateo County History Museum. Thank you all.